Open proceedings up for people's questions now. We have about 20 minutes really for questions and some quick responses. I'd like to give a few minutes to Paul and David at the end just to sort of sum up sort of key points they'd like to make. 20 minutes or so. I'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, get some responses, and we'll see how we go. So first of all, at the front here. Yeah, just wait for the microphone, sorry.
You have touched on Sri Lanka. We could take it as a general case where in conflict situations, especially intrastate conflict situations, things are very complicated, much more complicated than interstate conflicts. For example, now Sri Lanka tsunami time, they didn't give the Northeast as much aid as proportionately that aid was. I have met here in London a doctor, a nurse, and a journalist who said they were prevented from going to the Northeast at the time of tsunami. So it's like that. So the aid agencies have to bear that in mind. Now, in the last 6 months, in the compulsory detention camps, ICRC or MFF, the MSF or other aid agencies had very much restricted access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Is it on?
Give it a go and we'll see. I think it is,
A
yes.
very quick comment. Paul already knows. I read his report when it came out, and I'm from Merlin, and we really welcomed it. We thought it was very timely and actually raised a lot of questions for us within the organisation, even though we are already looking ourselves at how we work better with the Ministry of Health in our own work. But I suppose, throwing a question back to Paul and others about how he would like to see this going forward. I mean, we've had discussions in the organisation, but does he have some ideas of how we might address some of these issues collectively as organisations?
We'll take one more and then we'll pass it back to the panel.
Olivia Colin from Difford. I just wanted to ask Paul, the question around aid instruments has come up. And Jack mentioned the Central Emergency Response Fund that's in place to support the international system specifically. And I wondered, I mean, we've had kind of discussions around whether that should be expanded to support national governments. And we've kind of slightly, so far, dismissed that idea and said that actually the SURF should be kept specifically to support the international system and time of response, and it works well to do that. But then there still remains that gap in terms of what financial aid instruments can we put in place to support national governments. We've talked about direct budget support, but is there anything, do you see some solution at a more central level to be established in a kind of, in a SURF model, I guess?
Okay. Paul, do you want to
Yeah,
go
I
first?
just feel quickly on that. Sri Lanka is certainly complicated, so I'll avoid delving too deep into the complexities of that. But clearly, I mean, in the humanitarian response to the conflict over the last year, access and has been a key concern. But I think what it's one of the things it's demonstrated is the, I mean, it's back to the growing assertiveness of states. That you can't, the state has played the absolutely key role in determining what you can and can't do in providing aid as actors. So there's an absolute necessity to engage with the Sri Lankan state and to work with them in, over the last year and going forward. And at times that might mean, robust advocacy that might be quiet or it might be loud, and getting the balance right of that has been a very difficult dilemma for agencies. And there have been arguments about whether or not they got the balance right at different stages. But the state is certainly central and foremost in that. Other instruments, yes, it's the right question. I certainly don't have the answer. We just did a piece of work for the Norwegian government looking at whether or not there should be a thematic cap for disaster preparedness, and told them probably not, for lots of complicated reasons. But there's appetite amongst governments for thinking about different types of aid instruments and ways to better support national capacities, and I think that's a debate you need to take forward as donors. Ideally a bit more collectively than you did when you launched the SURF, but that's worked out all right in the end. But yeah, the right answer to that, I think, is yet. I don't have it. Going forward, I mean, that's one of the things I think could be taken forward. A conversation about funding instruments. There are a whole pile of them. I think, as you said, internally aid agencies need to look at how they relate to governments in their own internal policies and procedures, and the work you've been doing thinking about how you relate to the Ministries of Health is welcome. Clusters need to do more of it, so cluster lead agencies in thinking about how they do it, both in terms of their sort of cluster coordination roles. Simple things like the shelter cluster in Padang had simultaneous translation facilities, and that meant they worked much better with government than some of the other clusters which didn't. But there's a whole sort of raft of things that they should be thinking about. I mean, obviously the IDRL is enormously important, and the sort of continuing rollout and uptake of that is important part of this. And I mean, I think more broadly than that, I mean, what I was sort of edged towards in the report is the sort of suggestion that maybe you need sort of principles of good humanitarian government to go with the principles of good humanitarian donorship. But the problem with suggesting that is that, and the problem with sort of driving it forward is this is a debate that really needs to be sort of owned, taken forward, driven by G77 governments, and the last thing that they want or need is international consultants or aid agencies telling them what those principles should be, or indeed suggesting it as an agenda. So this needs to be sensitively taken forward. I think what David's talking about, the sort of growing interest of key regional bodies like ASEAN, is maybe where this debate can be fruitfully sort of encouraged and then sort of supported. But how that's done needs to be carefully done.
Thanks. David, did you have any comments you wanted to make? No? I have a question which I'll insert at this point, and please distract my attention as I'm talking if you want to ask a question as well. We've been doing some work here recently on the sort of evolving international stabilisation and related state-building agendas. And it just occurred to me when I was listening to you, Paul, where particularly when you were talking about the reticence, if you like, of pushing humanitarian action and funding through state channels. But there are cases where there is a more explicit international state-building agenda. Somalia is one example, for instance, where there are sort of donor pressures and UN pressures to work through very fragile, actually, state structures and systems. And I think that does create a lot of dilemmas for humanitarian actors engaged in some of these more difficult political environments. So I was just wondering whether there are any sort of lessons or examples that come up from the case studies that help to inform how to address dilemma. I suppose really it comes back to this issue of how to analyse capacity, that there are often situations where the capacity and the willingness of the government concerned is rather fragile, is one term you could use. And I suppose humanitarian donors and agencies need to make decisions about how to act when good humanitarian governance hasn't yet been achieved. But there are pressures to try and build institutions to reach a point where it might be achieved in the future. But in the current situation, it may create huge dilemmas. And as you said, the fragile states principles and good humanitarian donorship principles may not be entirely conflictual, but sometimes they can be in practice. So I was just wondering if there was anything that came out of the case studies that helped to address those kind of dilemmas.
Sure. Do you want me to take that, or do you want to?
Take that if no one else has got their hand up right at this moment.
Okay. The short answer is no, partly because we didn't do any conflict case studies. And the reason why we didn't is interesting. We wanted to. And we tried quite hard to do one in Sudan. But it didn't in the end just because it was too difficult, too politically sensitive. And by that time we'd run out of time. So, I mean, these issues are certainly important. As the agency expulsions in Sudan demonstrate, the government plays a crucial role in determining how and whether the international humanitarian assistance can be delivered, and certainly have an opinion on the role of international humanitarian aid. But getting at those questions is difficult. But more broadly, I think the sort of humanitarian system, the humanitarian sector, has been slow to really get to grips with the whole sort of fragile state stabilization, state building agenda, and needs to think sort of more, harder, better about how it relates to it, because otherwise it will be sort of subsumed, overwhelmed, ignored, all of which you see happening in different places. So Afghanistan's a good example. There's a recent Tufts report out about Georgia that I haven't read yet, but I think might be making similar points. So, I mean, I think in contexts like Afghanistan, you're back to the sort of more classic role of the need for sort of humanitarian actors to protect a neutral, independent humanitarian space, and to think about how they do that more effectively in the face of sort of strong political pressures to be subsumed into a sort of state-building agenda. But that traditional role is important, and thinking about how it can do that effectively is important. And then your point about the sort of the part of thinking about how you relate to states as international actors being a sort of political judgment about the willingness and capacity of states, it is well taken. And I guess one of the points that we're trying to make in the report is that the temptation in writing this is to be sort of stunningly optimistic about states, and to present a sort of, international aid actors are terrible at undermining state capacity and they ought to do more to build state capacities, and to prevent a sort of sunny perspective on that. And part of the reason we didn't just focus it on natural disasters and try to bring a bit of the conflict stuff in is of course that ignores the sort of political realities of some governments that are sometimes nasty, sometimes corrupt, sometimes incompetent. And you need to be realistic about what governments are and aren't able to do in particular contexts, and that is part of the analysis process.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know what your views for the whole panel about the lack of available state funding for early warning systems, particularly for tsunamis. I'm kind of relating more, especially around India, Indonesia, this kind of areas, and relating to the tsunami in 2004.
There was another one there.
We have another question there, yeah?
Slightly in a different vein. I'm Ripin Kalra, and I think I just had a thought which I thought I should air. And it's basically, famously, Florence Nightingale refused to corroborate with the charter when the IFRC was formed, citing that if there was somebody to sort out the mess of the wars, then the warring parties would be encouraged to fight even more. So I was wondering if there's that sort of situation or stance is being reviewed at the moment in broad policy terms.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Jack on EWS and Tsunami.
Okay. Well, there has been something called the Indian Ocean Consortium set up with funds partly from DFID to coordinate the establishment of an Indian Ocean early warning system. Was your question relating to state funding to governments?
Spent millions and millions of dollars on very
Yep, I agree, and I think that, I mean, that's not the only area of kind of managing risks that would benefit from more systematic and predictable funding, definitely. I think that, I mean, I was in Burma after Cyclone Nargis, and there was a certain amount of lesson learning on the part of even the government in Burma about the whole early warning sort of process and what happened and why so many people died. And it seemed from that lesson learning that actually messages were being transmitted from an Indian early warning system. This is obviously related to cyclone rather than tsunami. But the challenge was more getting the message out to the people who were about to be hit. So the early warning was received, but there were not the sort of mechanisms in place to properly transmit that. And if it was transmitted, then people perhaps didn't understand or give any credence to the warning message. So I think it just highlights the need to take a completely kind of broad, sweep approach to managing disaster risk, which would very much include early warning. And we're looking at how to, how we can better fund internationally in a more sort of, in a scaled up and more predictable way for all of these issues.
Florence Nightingale, yeah. We're about 100 yards from the Florence Nightingale Museum, and I worked here for 5 years and never got there, so I'm feeling like I should have done. And this is back to the idea, I guess, of the question I was sort of briefly posing in the presentation of whether international action sometimes undermines the political contract, social contract between a state and its citizens. And I back to my point. I guess I'm an old aid worker and believe in some sense in sort of getting out there and doing it, and in the humanitarian imperative to act in the face of avoidable suffering. So I think that sort of what we're saying in this report about the need to respect sovereignty, to work with governments where possible, all of those things is important. But I mean, to take up Deborah's point of view, it shouldn't be at the expense of sort of swift action when it's needed. And that therefore much of what we're talking about is back to Jack's stuff around the sort of the need to embed working better with national authorities into sort of contingency planning and preparedness, so that nationally led action is as swift and as effective as international action. Because after all, it ought to be. They're the people there who are better able to respond, and so it's about embedding that better.
Yeah, just one quick point to this. On the issue of early warning, obviously there's an issue for donors, but there's also a major issue for the countries themselves, right? And it comes down to their own priorities and whether they're budgeting for these things or not in their own budgets. And actually, laws can play some role in this. And India, for instance, adopted a new disaster management law recently, which requires every department to have a certain amount of its budget for risk reduction activities. It hasn't revolutionized everything, but it has made a difference. But you see, particularly, risk reduction is obviously a very wide topic. But in many countries, even very centralized countries, a lot of the responsibilities for risk reduction are at the municipal or local level. And very frequently, all the budget stays up at the national level. This happened in Peru. In the last couple of years, they've had this very important sort of decentralization process to put all lots of responsibilities at the local level that were never there before, including all the responsibilities essentially for risk reduction, and none of the budget went with it. And so this is what they found after the Pisco earthquake, which is that hardly anything had happened, and all the incentives at the local level were essentially to develop and sort of encourage that, and not to shut down dangerous building and those kinds of things. And having effective disaster management law at the national level that insists that certain amounts, that there should be budget lines for risk reduction, including early warning, is one way to address this. This cycle of a sort of surge of interest in disasters after a big one has happened, and then complete amnesia about a year later when the next budget cycle comes up. With regard to this sort of Florence Nightingale, I'm not exactly sure I don't want to attack Florence Nightingale. But I think that on the one hand, I think it's demonstrably clear that that a focus on international humanitarian law has tremendous benefits. Even when we see lots of violations of IHL in many parts of the world, you would see much worse situations where IHL is not taken seriously. And you can tell the difference in places of the world where that dialogue is not used very much, where the parties, neither of them, take it very seriously, and those where at least one of the parties do. The results are very different. And this is why I'd like to sort of to bring on one sort of minor criticism I would have of the report is that I would hesitate maybe to go quite as far as Paul did in this notion that we should essentially be mixing all the principles together. The idea that they have something to inform each other I think is very good, but there's a reason why we have a humanitarian principles that are for humanitarian affairs. And the fact that governments need to be empowered, particularly in the natural disaster setting, doesn't mean that you give up on that. And so I agree that I think there is still going to be a need for humanitarian assistance. This is why this project that we've been doing has been emphasizing both sides. It's not just sort of controlling the international actors, but also making sure that they're not stuck, that they can't provide any assistance.
Thank you. I think I'd like to invite everyone on the panel to make any sort of final responses or sort of key points that I'd like to make before we close. So we're going to close up in just a few minutes, but I'll actually run from Deborah back along. If there are any issues, Deborah, that came up in the questions and answers that you're keen to pick up on.
Not
really.
I can think of right now. No.
Just wanted to give you the opportunity before we close.
I wonder, I mean, just how we sort of keep this theme alive, and how we keep a sort of dialogue between interested parties. I mean, I don't know if ODI is sort of taking a specific role in taking this forward, or if it's going to be a theme going forward. I mean, certainly we would really welcome a kind of space to debate this in a sort of perhaps more structured and focused piece of work. I think that the IDRL guidelines that offer us a really concrete opportunity to actually sort of walk the walk on some of this stuff, because it's an established set of guidelines that has quite a significant buy-in, and sets out some of the key issues that we're talking about in practical terms, how we engage with states. So it'd be great to carry that discussion forward, basically.
Just as a quick HPG response to that, I would say that it's pretty apparent, and we were sort of reviewing the work that we're doing across various projects for a meeting just the other day with a number of external stakeholders. And I think what's clear is that there's hardly any area of work that we're concerned with at the moment that doesn't have these issues right at the centre in many senses. So I think that in a general sense, there's absolutely no question that we'll be taking this agenda forward in the work that we do at HPG, and I'm sure Paul will have some comment as regards humanitarian outcomes and his own work in this area.
We'll talk with both ODI and you about ways to take it forward, and have started that conversation in different ways. And also your current research program, Consortia, tenders around fragile states. I think we'll get at many of these issues as that research gets forward in next year. And that's it in terms of thought. It's past 7. I certainly want to eat and or have a beer. So I think we should probably wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and for the questions, and mainly I'd like to thank our panel of speakers for an excellent meeting. Thank you very much.